Hello and welcome to Get Hired Live. I'm Gianna Prudenti, LinkedIn's Associate News Editor for Jobs and Career Development. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm coming to you live from LinkedIn's office in New York City. Let me know in the comments where you're calling in from. Let us know what industry you're working in or maybe what industry you want to land a job in, and make sure you're connecting with each other throughout the show. As always, we will get to your questions towards the end, so make sure you're dropping those in the comments as well. I already see so many people joining us. Hello to Dolores and Yolanda in Texas, Cindy in Ecuador, Tina and Sweta in Canada, and Bonnie in California. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We have such an exciting show. We are talking about salary negotiations. Now, here in New York, many employers have begun disclosing salary ranges in job postings. And that's very valuable insight that job seekers can use when going into a salary negotiation. So to talk about how they can do that, joining me today is Cynthia Pong. She is a career coach and founder of Embrace Change. Cynthia, welcome to the show.
Hi, Gianna. Hi, everyone. Love to see the international audience today.
Thanks so much for joining us, Cynthia. To start us off, I would love if you could just share a little bit more about yourself and your work.
Of course. So my name is Cynthia Pong. I am the founder of Embrace Change. We are a coaching consulting firm. We specialize in working with women of color, although we also do work with people of color as our clients. It is our singular mission to ensure that all women of color get the money, power, and respect that we deserve in the workplace.
And we're going to talk all about that today, Cynthia. To start us off, I would love if we could talk about negotiation prep. How should job seekers prepare for that conversation during the interview process?
Right. So it's important to do your research and early so that you know your numbers. Numbers can make us sometimes a little bit uncomfortable because we might have different feelings about money, our worth, salary, things like that. But you got to know your numbers specifically, what you want, what would be good enough for you, and also what is not good enough and too low. So in order to figure that out, you need to be talking to other folks, figure out even when there is a salary range posted, whether that is a fair and commensurate salary range for whatever the job is. And the best way to do that is to start your research early by, Googling around, but also talking to people, specifically white men who do that job and role.
Yes, and speaking about numbers, I mentioned earlier that now many employers are disclosing salary ranges in job postings. How can job seekers use that number to their advantage when going into a negotiation? Is that something how should they factor that into their preparation? Should they bring that up during the interview? What's your thoughts on that?
So my thoughts generally are, do not talk about the salary until you're at that point where you have a written formal offer in hand. Anything before that, in my opinion, is premature, and you risk lowballing yourself or kind of honestly just giving too much information away about what you think, you bring to the table and things. So I would leave that all until that end stage of the interview. And we could talk about how to do that in a moment. But the range, if you have one, I would simply consider that to be a floor. In New York, they just changed these laws very recently, and already in the very beginning days and weeks of seeing that, you're seeing vast ranges for jobs. So things like from something below $100,000 to like 100,000 and into the multi-six-figure area. I mean, just huge ranges. So if the range is that big, it's kind of meaningless, right? But you can consider it to be a floor, and you know that you're talking about at least that much. Then I would make sure you're also using that to cross-reference with the job posting itself. So are the roles and responsibilities listed under this job posting matching up with the title, and are both of those things matching up with what the salary range is? And again, you would know that if you did your research and compared to other employers, comparable industry areas and things like that.
Definitely. I think using that salary range as a floor is really great advice. I want to say hi to some more members joining us. We have Paula in Texas, Patrick in Seattle, and Raven in Georgia. Thank you all for joining us. And make sure you guys are getting your questions in throughout, because we're going to get to those towards the end of the show. So Cynthia, when should this salary conversation happen during the during the interview process? Is that something you should bring up first and be upfront about?
So it's not about necessarily being upfront or not, but I do think that we should save the salary conversation and the negotiation around that for the part after you get a formal written offer letter, preferably. Sometimes it's really hard to get an offer in writing. So, defer to whatever the standard industry practice is for whatever industry you're in or what geographical area. But once you have actually the offer and they say, yes, we want to hire you, Cindy, or we want to hire you, Steph, at that point, then you can talk about the compensation. But you want to know, what are they offering you first as the compensation package, which includes more than just the base salary, though we are focusing on that today. So once you know what they're offering you, then you can take that into consideration and figure out how that lines up with your numbers. Remember, I said you want to know your 3 numbers of what you want, what would be good enough, and what would be too low. And then from there, you can figure out how to take the conversation further. Now, the reason I say, once again, not to say the first number first is because you do run the risk of lowballing yourself when you do that.
Yeah, I think that's definitely very challenging. A lot of times when people say, they're asked, what are your salary expectations in an interview? How should they respond to that question then if they shouldn't put their number out? Is it about asking for a budget, something like that?
You can ask for a budget. I think that's a very direct and forward way to ask about it, but you might get a little bit stonewalled. Like, you might not really get an answer to that, especially earlier in the process. Another thing you could do is say, well, like, I wouldn't be able to say until, we're further along in the process and I know a bit more about what the expectations really like for this role and responsibilities are. There's a couple ways you can talk about it, like a couple of template phrases, then folks can feel welcome to kind of adapt to your own situation. So you could say things like, oh, it's my practice to, not talk about salary until there's, we've actually figured out this is a good fit, that I'm a good fit for this role. Happy to talk about that, once we've determined that fit is correct. I have a client who actually has a brilliant way to say that. And she basically has her own version of that. And she says, oh, in my experience, the compensation has never been an issue if we've found out that it is a good fit between me and your organization. So that's a nice way to kind of draw that boundary and make it clear that you are happy to talk about that, but it's way too early to talk about it until you've gone through all of the stages of the interviews.
Yeah, that's a really great approach to take. And once the negotiation is happening, what are your thoughts on counter offering? I know a lot of times it could feel like if I give a different number that's maybe higher than the initial offer, that I could risk losing, what was initially on the table. So how should job seekers go about counter offering?
Right. So you do want to do it in the right way. And if you think about negotiation as a problem solving, like a collaborative problem solving process, then you stand a much better chance to not kind of, cause a breakdown in the conversation. Although that can simply be a red flag if they're not willing to negotiate with you at all and immediately rescind the offer, which is very rare, but it does happen sometimes, very rare again. That's a red flag. So maybe you dodged a bullet there and it wouldn't have been a good fit anyway. However, you can kind of make sure that you talk about, like, you're still very excited to work at this place. You would love to bring your skill set and your background, your expertise, and you see how it's such an ideal fit with whatever they are looking for. And then just talk about, but is there flex in the compensation? That's a very light toe in the water way to, like, see if there's going to be a constructive conversation in that area. Or you could kind of just say, like, I think for what I'll be bringing to the table and all the value that I'll be bringing, something more in the range of XYZ would be appropriate. So you can kind of say things nicely like that without completely making it like it's about to be a standoff or you're kind of throwing the gauntlet and making an ultimatum kind of thing.
Yeah, making it a two-way, conversation is definitely important there. And what's your advice to job seekers who maybe accept an offer and then later realize I maybe should have negotiated higher? Can you go back on that offer and renegotiate, or is it something you kind of just have to accept?
I'm of the mind that everything is negotiable and it's never really like too late. Hardly anything in career, Gianna, is like set in stone that you can't course correct, I think. So, if you find that out later, that's fine. And there's also no need to go into a shame spiral or anything about it. You did the best that you could at that time with the information that you had. And that's great. And we have to give you credit for that. If you have more information later on and you find out, oh, there was, more flex in that negotiation, the band was higher, what have you, it's fine. You just reopen the conversation, talk to your supervisor or whoever the decision maker is, and ask if you can talk about this so that you can realign what it is that you're doing with the compensation on the other side. So I think you can do it in a very neutral, open, collaborative manner.
And speaking of flex negotiation, what other parts of the job offer can be negotiated in addition to salary? So maybe if they can't meet you on your target salary, what else can you negotiate? What else should be on the table?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things nowadays. Certainly when you work, how you work, the remote hybrid thing. You could talk about budget for your role. Do you get a team to support you? There's also the kind of more traditional like HR comp things like sick days, what type of leave you can get, the PTO, paid time off and vacation, things like that, in addition to the schedule and all of that stuff. So really, it is worth sitting down and really thinking about what your ideal job would come with, as far as what does that look like? What does your ideal work day or work week look like? And what are all the things that you would need in order to succeed in this role and deliver for your team, the new employer, the clients, whoever that may be. So if you kind of just have a big brainstorm, throw everything out there that's ideal that you would want. And also, I know there's some Canadians here, but I always recommend to folks in the US to look at what benefits folks get in Canada, because it's usually so much better than I mean, there's movement there, but that can be like a nice gold standard, if you will, to sort of see what's possible.
Definitely. Yeah, taking that like holistic approach when looking at the job offer is definitely important. So love that advice. And so I know you mentioned earlier, if a company is unwilling to negotiate, that's definitely a red flag. And that should, be a warning sign that like, is this, a good fit for me? Do I want to work here? Is there anything else job seekers should look out for during that negotiation process that should like raise those red flags?
I think generally, if you're sensing a big shift in how they are treating you or how they're interacting with you, once you bring in that negotiation conversation, that is a red flag. I mean, what's up with that if they have a real lack of transparency about their process? And I'm also not suggesting that every single employer will be willing to flex on the base salary. Sometimes they really cannot, but that there's a difference between that and at least having the conversation with you and explaining the reasons behind that, or offering something else that could make up for it. Like, for example, if your priority really is to have a remote work situation, then like, are they also open to talking to you about that? If every single thing is like a no, 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 and they're not willing to hear it from you, and you can sense that their energy is starting to get a little, I don't know, either more aggressive or just rigid, then that's probably a bit of a red flag of what you might expect to anticipate once you do start the job. So take that into account. I also think that it's important for all of us, especially women of color and people of color, to pay attention to whether the words that you're hearing from people line up with the actions that you see. So if you are being kind of told a really nice tale and things sound so great and it feels like it's so good to be true, make sure it's not too good to be true. So match that up with what you've seen from this employer in the past. If you kind of Google what is their general reputation, if you talk to people who used to have worked there, what do they say about it? And kind of do your due diligence to make sure that stuff matches up.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think, negotiations can be and like job interviews very nerve-wracking, but really
Yeah.
being present in that conversation and aware is so important, because you'll become aware of all these different warning signs that you'll thank yourself later for avoiding. I want to say hello to some more members joining us. We have Deborah in Virginia, Marcia in San Francisco, Ron in North Carolina, and Alexander in DC. Thanks all for joining us. I want to remind everybody to make sure you're getting your questions and comments in throughout. We're going to get to those in just a bit. But before we do, Cynthia, I want to go back to our earlier conversation on pay transparency. With employers now posting salary ranges, I think for workers, you might see an open role on your team or the same position and realize maybe I'm being underpaid currently. So how can they go about having that conversation? Should they bring that up to their manager? And if so, how do you prepare for that?
Yeah, I think it is absolutely worth bringing up, because probably what's going to happen if you don't bring it up is that you might notice the kind of festering, increasing feeling of resentment that maybe you are being undercompensated for your role. So it's worth talking about, I think, absolutely, with your supervisor, your manager. And the way you can reopen that conversation is sort of similar to what I said before, in your one-on-ones, or set up another meeting if you don't already have regular one-on-ones, just ask if you all can have an open conversation about realigning what you've been doing with kind of the rate that is now being offered as far as compensation for the same work, like the equal kind of work. I think if you bring a neutral tone to that and kind of just make it very problem solving again, like we're working together on this. We all have the same goal in common. I want to stay here. You want me to stay here, presumably, because I've been doing good work. That should be sort of the vibe of the conversation. And then you just work it out. Like, what can we do to bring this back into alignment? Like in this current job posting that's out here right now, how can I help that process along? Do you need something from me to just, make this the proper, commensurate, appropriate, and reasonable pay for what I'm bringing to the table?
That's really great advice. And, you mentioned this earlier, but I want to expand on it a little bit. For people of color and women who have been historically underpaid, how should they approach the negotiation process? What should they be doing specifically?
Right. So I think it's twofold here. The first thing is really about mindset and making sure that you get yourself comfortable with whatever those three numbers are or the other numbers that might be involved. Because for those of us who have been historically underpaid, there's just a lot of conditioning that we have received from when we were young through our education, family background, cultural expectations, societal norms, the media, that kind of has chipped away at, I think, some of our comfortability around talking about money in a very transparent way. So doing your own work to get yourself comfortable, literally even saying the numbers that you're going to be saying is crucial. Because if you're saying, the salary I'm looking for is $185,000 and you sound really iffy about it, then you're not going to get that. You're just not, because the other person is going to sense that you are nervous about it. There's something going on, and then they're going to feel like it's too much of a risk to actually give you what you're asking for. So it can really chip away at your credibility if you are not confident in saying these words and numbers. So that's number one. And number two is really going back to what I said at the top and a few times, which is making sure you do your research and making sure you know that for this job, the substance of what this job entails, are you getting compensated fairly when you compare it to straight white men of a certain background, class-wise, who are doing that same role? And one last tip here, make sure that, again, that the title matches up with the roles and responsibilities. Because a lot of times for women of color, people of color, women in general, we are put in those roles where we're acting as the director, we're the interim director, or we're called an assistant or deputy director when functionally we are doing the director role. So you want to make sure that you don't fall into that trap and get paid for less than what you were actually doing.
Yeah. And, being confident in a negotiation is so key because it just, like you said, builds your credibility and just really helps you prove your worth and why you're deserving of that number. So I'm sure not being confident is a big mistake to make during the process. Any other mistakes that job seekers should be aware of so that they can avoid?
I would say, to this point of like feeling nervous and things, the antidote is practice. So, you don't have to despair if you do feel kind of like unsure about it. Just practice with whoever is around. Do a voice memo if you have nobody to talk to and then listen to it back. So I want to reassure folks that that's not like a deal breaker for you. It can be bridged. I think the other kind of challenge or barrier to look out for is just to make sure that you are not like getting lowballed. So a lot of times, because we think that a number sounds really great, like you all might have seen these things floating around on the internet where it's like, I was offered this job and it was offering me $120,000. I thought I could only get paid $100,000, so I took the $120,000 right away. And then later on, they find out that the budget went up to like 160, right? So that's a bad feeling because you feel that you had left money on the table. So this would probably be the second kind of mistake, if you will, that I'd point to, Gianna, which is really just not negotiating and not asking, because this is a bit of a pro tip, I guess, when it comes to negotiation, but you do actually want a no to your first counter offer. That feels counterintuitive, but you want to know so that you can then realize that you did hit that ceiling for whatever this is, and then you kind of work your way down from there. Otherwise, you might have left money on the table.
Definitely. And, I think that hesitancy to negotiate is especially, relevant for early career professionals. So I think that's a really great call out. And, we have so many member questions coming in. So I'm very excited to get to those. But before we do, Cynthia, one last one for me. I would love if you could just share like one big piece of salary negotiation advice that you would want our members to take away today.
Right. Everything is negotiable.
That's
It.
it.
3 words. That's all you have to remember. Try to internalize that. I know it sounds wild, but sit with it and then see if you don't show up differently in your conversations around money.
I love that. So let's get to some member questions now. And I think we've covered these a little bit, but just to expand on some topics,
Yep.
Dan brings up a really great point because he's talking about stock and bonuses. Should those be a part of the negotiation?
Oh yeah, in certain contexts, 100%. That would only apply in like a for-profit tech, that type of a situation. But base salary is only a small piece of the puzzle when you are talking about these type of broader compensation packages. So equity, stock, and there's all different types of stock options too. So you want to do your research on that. Is it restricted? Is it not? When does it vest? All that stuff. Bonuses, if I didn't mention that, and there's different kinds of bonuses. Sometimes you want to watch out because folks feel really great if there's like a sign-on bonus or a signing bonus at the beginning. But remember, that's not the same as a bump in base pay. It's a one-time only kind of cash thing, and like you don't get that again, So you want to balance that out, whatever's most important to you at the time. There might also be like performance-based bonuses. And then there's all kind of like non-financial things that also might really matter to you. Like, what are the leave policies? What's the support for people who are parents and caretakers? Is there a flexible work schedule where, we have one client who can even take PTO on an hourly basis to take care of family stuff. So like an hour from a Wednesday or something to pick up children from school, that type of thing. You want to really think about all of those and do your research online as to what is possible.
You just mentioned this a little bit, but when we're speaking about benefits, how do you specifically negotiate those? Like PTO, that's a very unique, having you could take off any hour. That's very unique. So how do you kind of bring up those alternatives if maybe that's not even something on your employer's radar?
Right. I think you can really suggest it as anything. And the things in negotiation, you can use anything as leverage for something else. So if you are asking for a higher comp and they're like, we cannot do that, Michelle, then you can be like, okay, well, I understand that you can't do the comp that I asked for. So what about, and then you put out this other thing that maybe they can do. That might be a new idea. And listen, some places that are kind of very, like maybe larger institutions that have a very set in stone kind of HR policy, and this is the comp package, what everybody gets, and that's it. You really might not get any wiggle room in those places, but everything is context by context. In maybe smaller organizations or more flexible places, you might be able to essentially barter one thing against another. If they can't do the comp, maybe you get more PTO, maybe you get more flex time, maybe you can work remotely, what have you.
That's great advice. And we have a question here from Michelle who asks, what do you do if the offer is so far low? Should you even negotiate at that point? So if it's really a lowballed offer, do you just walk away? What are your thoughts there?
It sort of depends on the context of what else is going on for you at that time. If you have 10 offers and everybody is recruiting you heavily, then maybe that one isn't even worth saying much other than like thanks, but no thanks. But if that is your one offer and you're really trying to get out of your current situation, then, maybe it is worth saying like, listen, this is really far from what I would be looking for and what what is commensurate for the value I bring for this particular role. And then you might suggest something like cutting the hours, perhaps. Like maybe it's like you work part-time on that, maybe you don't want part-time because that could cut into the benefits. Like, again, it's all very individualized to the person, but you might want to cut back the scope of what you have to do in that time so that at least could free up what's on your plate. There's all kinds of things that you can counter offer with. But I can't say kind of across the board that it's necessarily a deal breaker for everyone because it depends on your context and your options.
Yeah, I think that just goes back to your earlier point of just being totally transparent during the whole negotiation. So really love that. And Sweta brings up a good point about health benefits because they're usually non-negotiable due to discrimination. What are your thoughts there regarding health benefits? Can you negotiate them or?
I think it depends on the particular place. So some employers are not going to even like have those benefits. And this is pretty US specific, but if they have less than a certain number of employees, like you may not even get any of that stuff. So it might be a very bespoke situation where you kind of just get certain, I'll say benefits in quotation marks, because it's not like benefits in an HR sense, but they will allow you to do X, Y, Z, and that's just part of your understanding. And I would get that in writing, and that type of thing. But yeah, if it's like a large institution, what you see is pretty much what you get, unless and until you get to a leadership level where they can really like do a lot of different things. But that again may not apply to the health benefits piece.
We have a really great question here from Nisha. She asks, how would you negotiate more money based on earning a degree if you earned a higher degree while working at the company? So maybe she's currently a worker and earned a degree. Can you go and negotiate higher pay because of that?
Yeah, 100%. There's actually a really great example from this book called Never Split the Difference, which is, kind of a very cool methodology around negotiation that I, for the most part subscribe to. And there is a little vignette in that book that is literally where the person got their MBA funded by the employer at the time, and then afterwards got the tuition for the MBA like added on as their salary after, because that's the value add that they brought to the organization after that. So you do have to make the business case for any type of increase like that. But if you make a persuasive case and there is that funding there, then I think absolutely it's 100% worth asking. Whether you get it or not is a different question. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that goes, to that whole point of just, you never know unless you ask, and the worst you're told is no. So definitely go for it. Well, Cynthia, this has been so great. We have so many members in the comments saying that they love your advice. Everything is negotiable. So really love that. Thank you so much for joining us on Get Hired Live. I know there's so many great takeaways from this conversation for our members.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
And thank you all so much for joining me today. We will be off next week with the Thanksgiving holiday, but make sure you're following the LinkedIn news page for all the great programming we're always putting out. I hope everyone has a great holiday, and we'll see you when we're back.